On January 31st, 1968, tens of thousands of North Vietnamese soldiers and Viet Cong guerrillas descended on South Vietnam, launching a series of attacks that would become known as the Tet Offensive. The attacks caught the U.S. military by total surprise, and the heavy casualties that followed stunned the American public. It was a watershed moment in America's involvement in Vietnam, and the beginning of a painful admission that this was not a war that could be won. Now, a new book by the author of Black Hawk Down takes us deep into the bloodiest single battle of the Tet Offensive and of the entire Vietnam War. Hue 1968, a turning point of the American war in Vietnam, tells the story of the Battle of Hue largely through the eyes of those who experienced it on both sides of the conflict, and shows how the refusal by top American military commanders to admit reality ultimately resulted in the needless deaths of hundreds of American fighters and thousands of Vietnamese civilians. It is a story of human heroism, cruelty, and lies, and a must-read for anyone looking to gain a deeper knowledge of war then and now. And joining us now is the author of Hue 1968, Mark Boughton. Mark, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Ralph.
It's a moving and chilling book. But let me start talking about the Tet Offensive. You know, I think we're about the same age, so I remember the Tet Offensive. When I think of it, and I think a lot of people do, when you think of the Tet Offensive, you think about, you know, the attacks in Saigon, where the attackers almost made it to the U.S. Embassy. You don't think about the Battle of Hue, which was, in fact, the big event of the Tet Offensive. Why do we minimize the Battle of Hue? In memory, I think.
I think there are two reasons. One is that most of the American reporters who were in Vietnam were in Saigon. So they were there to witness the very dramatic assault on the U.S. Embassy grounds and the fighting that took place in the city. And that alone was fairly shocking, and I think kind of dominated the news cycle over the next couple days. There weren't that many reporters in Hue, and so that it didn't get the same kind of press coverage at the time, even though it was a far more significant event. And the other reason is that the General Westmoreland and the military command downplayed Hue, denied that it was happening, because they preferred the narrative that there was just these sort of small units that had launched these abortive attacks in cities, and they were quickly
some dead enders going in there.
Right.
Yeah, you know, and we'll get to that in a second. But let me ask you, why did the North Vietnamese decide to make Hue the big battle, sending in literally 10,000 troops? I mean, Hue was not, it was the third largest city in Vietnam, but it had not seen battle before to that extent.
Well, it's because Hue was the ancient capital of Vietnam, of the unified country, and it had a great deal of cultural significance to the Vietnamese, which of course it doesn't or didn't to Americans. And so I think taking the city of Hue, flying the flag of what they called the alliance government over the citadel, which was the big fortress in northern Hue, was a very powerful visual image in Vietnam, saying, we are going to win this war. We are, taking back our heritage as a nation, and Hue was the jewel of that heritage.
So by the time of the Tet Offensive, there were about 500,000 soldiers and Marines in Vietnam.
Right.
Why did this offensive catch the American military by such total surprise?
Well, I guess first you have to give credit to the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. They were very skilled at infiltrating all these troops.
Amazing, right?
It was amazing. I think it speaks to the distance between the American military command and what was actually happening in the city. They clearly lacked good intelligence. And lastly, I think it reflects the support that the revolution had among people, particularly in the rural areas outside of the big cities, because certainly everyone noticed 10,000 troops being amassed, and yet no one tripped an alarm.
Right. And then the commanders were saying the opposite, that the people were not supporting the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese.
Right.
But, one of the many horrors, of all the horrors that you write about in the book, the most disgraceful is the fact that, as you mentioned, the top brass refused to admit that Hue was a real battle. In fact, they had no idea that 10,000 troops were in there. And they kept ignoring the commanders on the ground and sending, basically to slaughter, suicide missions, hundreds of American Marines and soldiers.
Why did this happen? How could they not know? Why did they ignore the people who were fighting? Well, initially, Rafe, it happened out of ignorance. They were taken so totally by surprise that they found it hard to believe that it had happened. And then when their field commanders began radioing back saying, look, we're facing an overwhelming enemy force that's in fortified positions, they refused to believe it. They thought these were young Marines, young troopers who were panicking, because they'd never been in serious combat before. And a lot of the higher level commanders had seen action in Korea, some of them in World War II, and they believed they knew best, that they were better trained, better equipped, that they could easily handle the situation.
So it was arrogance as well as ignorance.
Arrogance, and there was racism too. I mean, in the disbelief that the Asian soldiers from this, what Johnson called a little pissant country, could somehow pull the wool over their eyes so effectively and mount such a serious challenge.
Well, so Westmoreland was obviously wrong about the offensive, wrong about Hue. But he and LBJ were not wrong when they said that the Tet Offensive had been a defeat for the North Vietnamese. I mean, using your own book, the criteria that the North Vietnamese themselves had, which was that the Tet Offensive and the Battle of Hue would cause a popular uprising and end the war. That didn't happen, and they were decimated. So to that degree, they were right, were they not?
They were, and in that limited definition of success, they crushed the Tet Offensive. They chased the enemy troops out of Hue. But I think the larger impact was the shock that the enemy could mount this level of an attack, which ran completely counter to the story that had been told the American people for years.
What are the lessons of the Tet Offensive and Hue for us, and have we learned the lessons?
Well, we've learned some. I mean, I do think our military adapts rather quickly and is far superior today to what it was 50 years ago. But I don't think our political leaders have learned to approach the world with humility, with an understanding of how complex situations are. We continue as a country to sort of project our political priorities, in this case in the Cold War, the spread of monolithic communism, as if it explained very complicated situations anywhere in the world. And we're still doing it. We did it in Iraq, and we're trying to do it in Afghanistan, and we find ourselves stuck in wars that we can't find a way out of.
Oh, well, Mark, if anyone wants to learn the lessons of the Vietnam War, they should read Hue, 1968, a turning point of the American war in Vietnam. It really is a must-read.
Thanks,
Mark,
Raph.
thank you
really
so much.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.